This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Hello and welcome to The Agenda. I'm Stephen Cole. And this week we're going to the cinema on what is already looking like a momentous year for the film business. As the streaming platforms look to sweep the awards season, we ask one producer if they could spell the death of the cinema experience.
Cinema doesn't compete with Netflix. Cinema competes with sports events, gigs, theatre. When you're going to go out, you want to go out.
As China overtakes the US at the box office, what does that mean for the kind of films we'll be seeing at our local multiplexes? And taking national cinema international, how films aimed at domestic markets are now busting global box offices. So, how exactly are the streaming platforms changing cinema? Well, the good news is that, so far at least, it appears watching at home on our computers or smart TVs isn't preventing us from watching on a big screen at your local multiplex. According to a report from Ernst & Young, those who visit the cinema regularly, and that's more than 9 times a year, are also the highest consumers of streamed content. Nearly a third of them also spend at least 15 hours a week watching streamed content online. But even given that statistic, cinema chains can't afford to rest on their laurels. Netflix alone has seen its subscribers around the world rise to 158 million. And while growth in the US is slowing, largely due to a rise in prices, subscriptions elsewhere in the world are speeding up. And that just might be because Netflix has started to use its seemingly unlimited budgets and notoriously hands-off approach with filmmakers to create truly prestige projects. Martin Scorsese couldn't get a traditional film studio to back his hit The Irishman, so Netflix stepped in and could win its first Best Picture Oscar for its trouble. An art house favourite, Noah Baumbach's latest awards-bait Marriage Story was also a Netflix production. And it's not just Netflix, of course. Amazon was the first streaming giant to win an Oscar for one of its films with Manchester by the Sea back in 2017. Cinema chains aren't happy. They say the fact you can only see these films on a big screen for a matter of weeks, if at all, before you can watch them at home, means they're not really cinema films, but in fact are made for TV movies. And directors too can't seem to agree on whether or not streaming is a good or a bad thing. It certainly has Pedro Almodovar worried.
They have to survive mixing with mobiles, the TV, home video, or tablets, that we have to coexist together. And my fear is that, for example, in Spain, every day, every week, any theater is closed. So that's a pity, because I think that the cinematic experience, you need to be in front of a big screen, in silence, in the darkness, and surrounded by strangers. And the movies were created for that.
Although German auteur Werner Herzog, the man behind classics of European cinema like Fitzcarraldo and Nosferatu and Grizzly Man, can see the benefits.
Streaming is massively coming at us. We all know it, and many of the big things are coming right into streaming. It has an advantage for me, because all of a sudden films that I made 45 years ago are seen by 15-year-old kids in Missoula, Montana. God knows where that is, but they're very excited because they see a film, let's say Enigma of Caspar Hauser, which I made when their parents were not even born yet. But all of a sudden, because of streaming, they are available. That's a great advantage. Otherwise, I'm somebody who still loves the theater, the cinema, and the collective experience.
But with Disney Plus and Apple joining Netflix and Amazon in the content game in late 2019, it looks like the battle between big and small screen is only just the beginning. So those are the vital statistics, but how are they influencing how filmmakers actually work or approach their work? I spoke to producer Piers Tempest from Tempo Productions, the man behind Oscar-nominated The Wife, Liam Neeson starred Ordinary Love, and many other top films, whether the rise of the streamers, Amazon, Netflix and so on, did make a difference to his approach to getting his films made.
As a producer, one wants as many people as possible to see the movie you're producing. So I've never been of the opinion that it's either or. So I think Netflix and the streamers are a great asset for the film industry, because it's providing new audiences for movies. And I don't think there's competition. I think people still love the collective experience of going to the movies and to get that real sense of sharing emotion, which I think is so powerful. And often people then can go and watch the movie again on Netflix, and Netflix also, or any of the streamers, it can open up independent film for new audiences. So I think it's good. I think the theatrical experience works really well, and the streaming services work very well. But definitely, there's room for both.
There's a sort of contradiction there, a dichotomy, isn't there? Because you want the collective experience, but there are many people watching the films individually on their own on streaming platforms.
I think it very much depends for a producer on what the genre of film is and what the aspirations theatrically are for the film. And I'll give you 3 examples. One was Ordinary Love, which is a film we have in cinemas at the moment. And that's Liam Neeson and Leslie Manville. And the target audience is very much the same as The Wife, which is a Glenn Close, Jonathan Pryce film, which I produced last year.
And was very successful.
Thank you. And that is very much targeted at an older demographic, female skewed. And that demographic is still going to the cinema and consuming specialist theatrical movies internationally. Where there is a difference, I think, is in more male skewed films, if we're going to get technical on this. And films like Driven, which I produced in 2018, I think would have played theatrically 5-6 years ago. But that did sell to a streamer because it didn't have a major star in it, and also it was much more male skewed. So that worked very well on streaming services. Universal bought that.
You sold your next film at Cannes last year to Netflix. Was that a difficult decision?
The first film I ever sold to a streamer was Love, Wedding, Repeat, which we shot in 2019 in Italy. And Netflix came in and acquired the film worldwide 2 weeks before we started photography. And the decision we all made was, should we make the film and then try and sell it theatrically, which is actually what it was intended to going in. But then we thought, actually, in terms of getting the film out to 190 million people in a genre, a romantic comedy genre, which really works and people really consume, it changed the dynamic on it, and it's been a very good changed my thinking, and changed the dynamic in terms of what our expectations theatrically were for the film. And we thought, yeah, great, let's go for it. Let's not be Luddites, and let's go for the new reality.
This year's awards seem to be dominated by Netflix. The Marriage Story, Two Popes, The Irishman. Do you think the other studios have to really start to up their game?
I think so. I mean, you look at what's in 2020. What are the Netflix awards movies? And you know, Two Popes, Jonathan Pryce. He's going to be really pushed for Best Actor. You're looking at A Marriage Story, Scarlett Johansson, just breakout role. And obviously The Irishman, which is a massive play for Netflix. So I think, they're actually 3 of my favorite movies of this season. So I'm sure the studios are incredibly conscious that the world is slightly changing.
Yet people are definitely going to the cinema in Europe and especially in China, where the audiences are growing exponentially, aren't they? Can they live alongside the streaming platforms?
I think 100%. It's a film we've got coming out in March called Military Wives, and that's very much a collective cinematic experience. It's about a choir of women who come together, and it's very much, you sit in an audience watching a movie, and that's precisely what the theatrical experience is for, because you feed off everyone else's laughter, everyone else's tears. It's a great collective experience. And I think cinema's always going to provide that. And it's also, I've got 4 kids, and having to make them sit down in a cinema so they're not on 50 devices kind of, walking in and out, and to actually focus on the movies is great. And I think the cinema offering with premium seats and just, it's more comfortable now, get, nice food. It's a really good, it's not, cinema doesn't compete with Netflix. Cinema competes with sports events, gigs, theatre. When you're going to go out, you want to go out. So I think the main competition, it's a night out. It's you go to cinema, you go to a restaurant. If you want to get out of a house, I don't see the streamers really as competition. I think that they I see them as a compliment, really.
And that's a film producer, Piers Tempest. Well, still to come after the intermission here on The Agenda, how China is changing the economics of global cinema. And we'll be hearing how the film industry saved the UK from recession in 2019. On The Agenda with me, Stephen Cole, we look up into space. We look down into data. We look at debt. We look at politics. We look at opioids, climate change. We look at all the issues that really matter around the world. But you matter too. We want to tell the stories you want to see and hear about. Make it your agenda.
Each day, there are millions of stories. Each one can open new perspectives, new possibilities. Wherever you look, we are there. To see, discover, explore. We put the pieces together to find what really matters to you. All around the world, all around the clock. Our reporters are at home across the globe. From our headquarters in Beijing and production centers in Washington, Nairobi, and London, China Global Television Network. Stories from across the globe, reaching people across the globe. CGTN. See the difference.
CGTN Europe.
Welcome back to The Agenda. 2020 is looking to mark a major change in the world of cinema. And that's because it's expected to be the first year where China will overtake the USA as the world's largest market for films. Box office revenues in China are expected to leap to around $15.5 billion this year, while US receipts stick at around $12 billion. The rise of the middle class in China has had a massive impact. Their demand for cinema has seen around 25 new screens opening every day. There are now over 60,000 cinema screens in China, a third more than the 40,000 in the US and Canada. So what does this mean for the global film market? Well, in one sense, it's great news for the rest of the world's filmmakers. American and European directors now have a brand new market to attract, and that can make a real difference. Let's look now at an example from last year. Angelina Jolie's latest sequel, Maleficent Mistress of Evil, opened to a disappointing $36 million in its first weekend in the US. That's 45% lower than the first film 5 years ago. But in China, it made $22.4 million that same weekend. So that's 15% higher than the previous film. It flopped in America, but the overseas market, led by China, saw the $185 million budgeted film more than break even, taking almost $500 million worldwide. But while China can save a US box office bomb, it may be a while before homegrown content resonates beyond China's borders. The highest grossing film in China last year was animated fantasy adventure Naujia. It made $715 million domestically. In the US, though, it made 99.5% less. Well, with me now is box office expert and features editor of Screen International, Charles Gant. Charles, welcome to the agenda. Is China's box office growth redefining the definition of a hit film?
I'm not sure it's redefining the definition of a hit film. What I do think is that it's completely transformed the landscape for film, particularly for films that travel outside the US and have an ambition to compete on the global stage. China used to be, 20 years ago, pretty insignificant portion of the pie, and is now a vitally important piece of the pie. And if you look at a movie like Avengers Endgame, which overtook Avatar to become the biggest film ever at the global box office. More than $600 million of its $2.9 billion total came from China. That is a big chunk compared to Avatar, which is a 10-year-old film. China was a much less developed market 10 years ago. So it has in a sense, it's kind of slightly low. The success of China has slightly lowered the bar and made it easier for films to rack up these huge numbers than was the case 10 years ago.
And especially perhaps foreign films? What we would consider foreign films in Britain? I'm thinking of Parasite, I'm thinking of Roma. These are now high-profile films.
These are high-profile films, and actually Capernaum, which is a film from the Middle East, which is a very charming, heartwarming film, but not an obvious global box office smash. No. And it was huge in China, but I think that's more the exception than proves the rule. The non-Chinese films that are succeeding in China are still more likely to be big Hollywood blockbusters. What I would say is that they might be a film with an Asian flavour, like Godzilla King of the Monsters, which was, frankly, a bit of a flop in most Western markets. Actually did very well in China, and that was pretty, I would say, saving grace for the overall box office of that film.
We've already seen a number of US films try to add a Chinese element, haven't we, to make the films perhaps more box office?
We have seen that, and Transformers Age of Extinction is a notable example of that. Ridley Scott's The Martian, the shark disaster film The Meg had a strong Chinese element, but I don't think it's something you can do in every film, because for one thing, I think Chinese audiences would feel patronized if every big Hollywood movie has this sort of little kind of sop to the Chinese audience. I think they will start seeing through that. And a movie, movies that were big this year in China, including Avengers Endgame and Fast and Furious, Hobbs and Shaw, they succeeded by being true to themselves, and I think you can't just shoo in a Chinese element.
But some films don't work. Some films that work in many parts of the world don't work in China. Star Wars, the latest Skywalker film, that hasn't really been a hit in China, has it?
Star Wars has never really been a big property in China, and audiences, local markets, they have their own taste, and they won't just go and see a film because it's getting a big global push. Pixar has also never been, huge. Toy Story 4 is not doing particularly well in China. So the Chinese audience knows what it likes, and it likes what it knows, and actually what it mostly likes is domestic product. So 8 of the top 10 films of 2019 at the Chinese box office were Chinese films.
And where are the Chinese audiences seeing those films? On their devices or on cinema screens?
I'm talking about at the box office. So I imagine there's also a lot of people watching films on devices, but I'm saying 8 of the top 10 at the Chinese cinema box office were Chinese films.
What about the other way around? The biggest film in China last year took more than $700 million in China, but it didn't take anything like that outside China.
One of the challenges that Chinese films face, and in fact films from any non-English speaking market face, is that some of the most important markets for film, including the United States and the UK, we do not dub. We do not dub films. We only subtitle films. So the foreign language films that succeed in the UK and the US are art house films,
right,
for an art house audience that doesn't mind subtitles. Mainstream comedies, mainstream action movies do not export terribly well from foreign countries for the simple reason that the audiences for those films do not like subtitles. So that is one of the key reasons. So you'll get art house movies like Ash's Purest White exporting from China successfully to countries, Western Europe, but the kind of big mainstream movies from China are not going to play, and they have a different star system, and it's a bit of a vicious circle where, because there are no Chinese blockbusters that have succeeded in America, people are not familiar with the Chinese stars, and because they're not familiar with the Chinese stars, they don't rush out to see the next Chinese blockbuster. So I'm not really sure how we kind of break through that.
Charles Gant, features editor of Screen International. Many thanks for joining us here on The Agenda.
Thank you.
So we've considered how independent producers and Hollywood studios are dealing with the rise of the streaming platforms and of China as the new king of the box office. But how do national cinema organisations deal with the changing nature of the global film business? Here with me to answer that is a Director for International Affairs for the British Film Institute, Neil Peplow. Welcome to The Agenda, Neil. Your job is to find commercial opportunities around the world for the BFI and British film in particular. What are those opportunities now?
Well, I think actually the position looks for commercial and also cultural opportunities, and the two are actually linked. So I think the opportunities are talking to countries like, for instance, China, where we've been developing networks and relationships, to find out how we can make sure that British independent cinema is seen by Chinese audiences, but at the same time, how we can make sure that Chinese films are distributed within the UK. And then what we find is from those cultural exchanges, we can develop commercial relationships. So we are still looking at China as a strong partner moving forward in 2020. We're also looking to America because, as you said, the streaming platforms have huge demand for production services, and we've had a massive success story around that. We're incredibly busy. About £3.4 billion worth of investment every year into the UK industry comes from high-end TV and from film. And that kind of vibrancy, the vibrancy of the industry, allows us to develop new talent through the independent cinema side, which then we can promote internationally. I think Africa is potentially an important opportunity. You've got Middle East is, and we have been talking to various organisations. We've got obviously Dubai Expo coming up in 2020, so working out how we can promote British services, production services, but also culture through that.
Is that the core of your job, to promote young British talent?
Yes, I think it's about promoting young British talent, but also about promoting British film culture in general.
What does that mean, British film culture?
Well, we've got an archive, which is one of the biggest archives in the world. It's massive. And we have the second biggest collection of American film and TV outside of America. But also we've had prints of key Chinese early archive, which we've shared with China and actually exchanged by handing them a copy of this very rare archive. So we are there to be at the centre of a lot of discussion around where moving image is. When we were set up in 1933, television hadn't yet been broadcast in the UK until, 1936. Sound had just been invented, and there was still the impact of sound. And so we've been there for the last almost 90 years, figuring out what is independent cinema. How can it reflect a nation?
Have you figured it out yet?
Well, and that's the great thing about the job, is every year it evolves, and it's making sure that we can adapt quickly enough to make sure that independent cinema still has a place.
How have you adapted to streaming?
Well, I think there's a positive impact, which is the talent that we have, like Phoebe Waller-Bridge, who finds another channel to reach a much wider audience, both domestically and globally. And then the production opportunity, which has an industrial impact, which allows us to contribute to GDP growth. The reason why the UK didn't go into recession the last quarter of last year was because film production was increasing at 8%, which helped us stay out of recession. So it's a massively important industry to the UK now. But I think in terms of the cultural side, it's ensuring that we are still protecting those stories which reflect us as a country. If you go back to the BFI Charter, we were set up to do just that. How do you use film to represent who we are as a nation?
And it's fair to say, when you're doing that, representing the UK as a nation, you're not thinking about Marvel films or Skywalker films.
No.
What sort of films are you?
I mean, I think Marvel and Skywalker represent the skills that we have and the ambition that we have.
Certainly true.
And the ability that we can craft.
Which is why so many people make films in Britain.
Absolutely. But I think when you're talking about how do we represent ourselves on film, you have such a wide, diverse range of representation from Gosford Park through to Blue Story, from Downton Abbey through to The Rocks, which is a new independent film which did very well in Toronto, which is kind of about inner urban London life and very diverse and representative of who we are today. And it's understanding that that's the broad range of cultural values that we have as a nation, and embracing.
So there is an international market for that kind of material.
Absolutely. Downton Abbey is doing very well in China at the moment. Blue Story here has done very well locally. It's taken about £5 million, and it's a small independent feature from a first-time black director. And so it's making sure that we understand how to best promote our talent and culture internationally, and that's the kind of focus of the role.
Lastly, what do you say to the doom-mongers who say the big screen cinema is finished because the future is on small devices?
Look, I think the whole thing about technology is it actually offers more opportunity. So the smaller the screens get in your hand and the bigger the screens get in your front room, regardless, people want to have a community experience when they see certain types of film. And I think that will never change. Teenagers will want to go out and watch movies outside of home. The parents will want occasionally to leave their children behind and have some time to themselves. And I think the cinema offers that opportunity.
Oh, that choice.
I think the important thing is ensuring that audiences understand that there is content on their local cinema which actually reflects what they want to see. And it's ensuring that we get that link between the demand and the content right. And I think that's another role that the BFI can take.
Excellent. Neil Peplow, many thanks for joining us here on
Pleasure.
The Agenda.
Thank you for having us in.
The Hollywood actor Brad Pitt said that he really likes streaming services because they show what he calls gutsy material. And there's no doubt they do tend towards being more adventurous than the usual Hollywood fare, sometimes rather predictable productions. Pitt says, "I'm seeing material that studios aren't able to gamble on," which is not strictly true. But what is true is that at the beginning of a new decade, you have greater choice than ever before on your television, laptop, tablet, or smartphone. New technologies and ideas have shaken up music, gaming, and now film. And we're talking about a global film industry estimated today to be worth more than $136 billion. And these movies are entering our homes without undergoing the traditional cinematic lifestyle, and that's because the public, us, well, we're getting too impatient to wait even a few weeks to see a film of our choice on our devices. As the streaming business model is copied by dozens of rivals, over 700 million subscribers are now streaming video across the planet. Netflix has been instrumental in predicting, shaping, and indulging our impatience. It hasn't merely closed a theatrical release window, it's lobbed a brick through it. And tied to that brick is a note that reads, "Welcome to the future." Well, next week on The Agenda. Conserving the future underwater and on land. We meet the next generation of climate activists. Don't forget, for more Agenda content, you can visit our website, or you can follow us on Twitter and Facebook. But for now, from me, Stephen Cole, and all the Agenda team here in London, it's goodbye.